So my name is Chris Diehl. I'm a principal and co-founder of the Data Guild, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to speak with you tonight. Thank you for sticking around. I know it's tough to be the last at bat here. I've got lots of pictures and lots of stories to share, so hope this will be enjoyable for you. What I want to do today is actually share some thoughts with you that I've been thinking about over the last couple of years. Probably over the last decade, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how organizations learn and how technology can be used to enhance that process. One of the kind of early questions I asked myself was, how can organizations, or how should organizations operate in environments that are fundamentally unpredictable? And just by asking that question, I'm already kind of signaling some aspects about my beliefs about the state of the world and some of the challenges that we face. And so over probably the first half of my talk, I want to basically lay out those beliefs for you, kind of frame out a perspective. And then I'll move into actually presenting an answer to that question. And along the way, we'll contextualize how technology can support that process. Yes, sir. Oh, where do I want to start? So when I left graduate school, I left and graduated in December of 2000 and went to join the Applied Physics Lab at the Johns Hopkins University, which is a laboratory that's basically focused on supporting the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. Within the first year that I was there, obviously 9/11 happened. It was a huge wake-up call, obviously for the nation and for those of us in the national security community particularly. This is a photograph that I took literally days after 9/11, standing on a hilltop not far from the Pentagon. It was a really kind of remarkable moment there, standing there in silence with a number of people, kind of looking at what originally was quite surreal, it became something really quite real to us. Over the next couple years, again, those of us in the community were trying to think about ways in which we could mitigate that kind of future surprise. Certainly moving into the kind of 2004, 2005 timeframe, social media was on the rise. This is obviously pre-Facebook, but the blogosphere was really, was growing and very active. And members of the community were very interested in ways in which we could exploit social media to understand distant societies, foreign societies. The picture that I have here, and that I hope you can see, actually is a representation of the Persian blogosphere circa 2008. This is work that was done at the Berkman Center in Harvard. They did the kind of first survey of this, where they first did a broad collect over what they thought constituted the Persian blogosphere. They did some clustering of that graph, and then they did actual hand annotation of those clusters to try and understand what they were looking at. One of the most interesting things about this investigation, or actually one of the most surprising aspects of it, was just how active this community was. In many respects, as you conceive of Iran and the nature of that society, you would think that open communication online, particularly by notable individuals in Iran, would be fairly limited. But there were folks here who were actually quite vocal in ways that were very surprising. Because of that, interest built and continued to build in terms of trying to exploit these kinds of data sources and also think about ways, again, that we could mitigate future surprise. Along that way, I would say some rather fantastical claims came forth in terms of what we might be able to predict from these kinds of data sources. And some of these kind of patterns of belief continue today. So I'm fairly new, relatively speaking, to Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. I moved out here about 5 years ago. And one of the really striking things for me, kind of living through this growth of big data and data science and all the hype that's around that, is just hearing kind of repetitions of patterns of belief of what we can do with data, right? So in many quarters, certainly within the US government and now outside in broader circles, there's this belief that we're only limited essentially by how much data we can store and compute on. Basically, the more data we can get, the more we can know, the more we can predict, and there really is no limit to that. And what I want to share with you today is essentially a counterpoint to that, which is I want to articulate the belief that there are fundamental limitations that we face. And we need to understand what regime that we're in. So that some of the methods that Omar was talking about in terms of machine learning and data mining and things, there are certain regimes in which we're totally justified in applying those algorithms and expecting them to generalize. There's other regimes in which we shouldn't have any of those expectations. And it's really important for all of us to understand where those boundaries are. So again, what I want to first emphasize is that there are environments in which organizations operate, environments that we're exposed to continuously that are going to be environments in which surprise is really the norm. And to really kind of emphasize this point, what I want to do is first walk through some examples of significant surprises that we've all been exposed to in the last 10 years. The very first place I want to start is in the political sphere. I want to talk about the Arab Spring. Okay, so the Arab Spring. So for those of you that may not be familiar with the history of kind of where this started, it basically kicked off in December of 2010 time frame in Tunisia. It began with this one particular gentleman, a young man probably in his mid to late 20s, who was a fruit vendor. On this particular day, he went out like many other days to sell his wares. Like many past days, he encountered some corrupt government officials who came up and took some of his wares without paying. He tried to bribe them to get some of his fruit back. That didn't work. They publicly humiliated him. This particular person actually knew his family, was basically publicly berating him and cursing his family and all sorts of other nastiness. The gentleman left that area, went to a nearby government office, tried to seek redress, got no support. He came back, talked to his friends, and said, I'm going to show the world what we're faced with every day. And after that, he went away, showed back up at that government building, doused himself in gasoline, set himself on fire. That particular event, that was really what catalyzed what happened over the next coming weeks. So basically, 4 to 5 weeks later, the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia fell. Ben Ali left, went to Saudi Arabia. Everybody was blown away that basically the regime crumbled so quickly. And then the rest of it, I'm sure you know. Basically, that shockwave, if you will, then rippled across the region. And we're still watching this story unfold, right? Now, if you were to say, as some members of Congress said to the intelligence community, why didn't we know about this, right? Why didn't we see this coming, right? Can you imagine trying to predict that particular action would actually set the region on fire? A day that was not unlike many other days. If we now move over into the economic sphere, we all lived through the global economic or financial crisis of the 2007, 2008 time period. Here we had a situation where we had a number of different factors that came together, right? So we had complex financial instruments that were being traded that ultimately people didn't really understand what they were dealing with. Yes? Sure, I'll try to shout more. Yeah, thank you. So in this time frame, for this particular event, we had the situation where we had a number of different factors coming into play. So these complex financial instruments nobody really understood and were being traded. They were also being misrepresented by financial regulators. We had a lack of transparency. All of this kind of came to a head at one point when the marketplace basically just started to seize up. And there was great fears about how that was going to ripple across the globe. If you ask people who worked on Wall Street, was this a surprise? Many would say, no, it was not a surprise. We knew this was going on, right? So to first order, they knew there was a problem. They didn't understand when that was necessarily going to transpire. And the thing that really surprised everyone was the pace at which the cascading failures happened. So when these institutions started to fail, and the repeated failures started to happen, no one could anticipate those higher order effects. That surprised everyone, right? So there's a certain, kind of complexity in this system that is just basically impossible to really comprehend. If we now finally switch to technology, right? Technology is rife with surprise. And when we talk about this, typically we're thinking about like disruptive innovation, where maybe some new breakthrough comes along that leads to certain types of products that then disrupt markets. The particular focus of surprise in this domain that I want to talk about, because it's one that I have a lot of experience with, is cybersecurity. If we talk about the internet, is really probably, I don't think anyone would argue that it's the most complex man-made system on this planet. And it's something that we're continuing to build out with the Internet of Things. Basically, we've built this system that is so complex that no one can understand its vulnerabilities. And we're building out this persistent asymmetry that causes a problem in terms of security. Because if you're an attacker, you only have to be right once. If you're a defender, you need to be right all of the time. Right? And there's a reason that you're hearing these stories in the media over and over again about, whether it's Target or this, other commercial institution, or, certain defense contractors that are having all of their intellectual property siphoned off by some unknown foreign government. Right? These patterns of behavior are going to continue because precisely of this asymmetry that exists. And it's our inability to understand that complexity that drives this persistent surprise. So now, stepping back from those examples and just to review, the question is, okay, what are those fundamental limits? Let's just kind of run through again what those factors are. The first thing is again, when we have these complex systems, whether they're social systems, economic systems, technological systems, there's so much complexity and nonlinearity and interconnections and interdependencies between these different factors that it's hard for us, even in the best of circumstances, to comprehend that. So if I were God and I could give you basically a complete visibility over one of these systems, I could still have a problem where if I give you a certain amount of uncertainty and an input to that system, that uncertainty can ripple through the system and blow up to the point where you basically can't say anything meaningful about its future state. But that's not the world we live in. Right? We never get to see the full system. Right? We're always constrained by limited observability. We don't know how much of the system we're actually seeing. We don't know if we're actually considering the most important factors. Right? And we certainly don't understand how all of these things interrelate. Finally, we have this issue of cognitive bias. Right? All of us have inherent biases in how we perceive things in the world. Whether it's things like hindsight bias, where things that happened in the past that we've been exposed to are things that we ascribe a higher probability to or higher likelihood to. Or things like post hoc fallacy, where when you see a temporal sequence of events, you're much more likely to ascribe causality to those in certain cases where it's really not justified. And this has to do with how we can think about these events, right? We tell stories, we construct narratives. Right? Inherent in those narratives, right, is we're kind of developing essentially a reductionist explanation of what we think is going on. And then we use that, whether we're aware of it or not, to make predictions about what we think is going to happen in the future. And that sets us up for this repeated cycle of surprise. So there's this gentleman, Nassim Taleb, who's wrote a really popular book called The Black Swan. And he introduced this concept of the black swan. It's essentially a low probability, high consequence event that was previously unforeseen, right? So there's a couple things to unpack there. So first, the event itself is not on your radar. You're not thinking about it. It's just not something that you're necessarily going to conceive of happening in the future. Even if you do, the thing that makes it high consequence is the environment in which it happens, right? So if you're trying to predict the black swan, not only do you have to predict that the event will happen, but the nature of the environment that makes it high consequence. So going back to the example in Tunisia, that gentleman lighting himself on fire in that particular environment, right, led to the events that we're seeing unfolding. There could be other environments where he would have done that and we wouldn't have seen that outcome. Trying to predict that is so difficult. It's basically impossible. So if you agree with what my basic premise, which is in these complex environments, there's very little we can say about the future. Right? Then the question is, if you're an organization, whether you're a government or a multinational corporation or what have you, and you're operating in these environments, and you're trying to reason about them and make decisions, what do? What is your approach? And the basic answer to that question that I want to leave you with is we need to change our focus. We need to go from thinking about the future and trying to predict the future to actually trying to understand the present as quickly as possible. So the idea is basically to understand the present, to understand the now, look for opportunities and try to exploit those opportunities as fast as you can. Because you don't know even how long those opportunities will persist. Right? Once you embrace that idea, then that leads you to a very different place in terms of how you think about how an organization should operate and ultimately how technology can help that process. And we're going to start to unpack some of that now. So to think about some of these ideas, the first thing I want to do to talk about kind of organizational learning is I want to borrow an idea from fighter combat, from the theory of fighter combat. This is an idea that emerged a number of decades ago. There was a famous fighter pilot in the US Air Force by the name of John Boyd, and he was thinking about dogfighting and trying to understand how to analyze dogfighting. And one of the key insights that he had was he said, okay, if you've got two fighter aircraft and you're trying to understand which one will dominate, if you just focus on the performance characteristics of those machines solely, you will be misled. The idea that he advanced is he said, look, there's a human in that driving that system. And combat in this situation is two human machine systems competing against one another. Right? And precisely it's what that human chooses to do and how quickly they can learn about their environment, make decisions, and act. That's a key determinant in terms of who will be victorious. So the way that he described this is he talked about 4 different states that the human is going through. They're observing, they're orienting, they're deciding, and they're acting. So you'll often hear this described as what's called the OODA loop. Boyd himself actually didn't describe it as a simple loop, but just for simplicity's sake, we often talk about this as a singular loop and moving through those different states. And his assertion was in fighter combat, the pilot that can move through that cycle faster will win. They will dominate. The other opponent, if they're slow in trying to understand what's going on and taking actions and being decisive, they will always be behind the power curve. They will always be trying to understand and failing to understand what their opponent is doing. This idea really generalizes and can be a useful metaphor for us to think about how organizations learn more broadly. So taking that idea to heart and now asking the question, okay, well, what organizations today actually do this? Are there any good examples? Well, first and foremost, the companies that we're all very familiar with, Facebook, LinkedIn, Amazon, these very data-driven companies that are focused exclusively online. Microsoft does the same thing as well. Right? The key innovation that they've had is they're leveraging their ability to conduct high volumes of low-cost experiments all of the time to understand their environments very quickly. Again, to identify opportunities and to exploit them. Right? That's a really key innovation. The real question is, okay, well, how do we generalize from that? A lot of people are excited about big data and data science precisely because of what these companies have accomplished. And they're trying to understand kind of what is that generalization. And this is where a lot of the fantastical claims come from, right? Is people think that the model that we see here can then generalize to other domains. So whether we're taking on bigger issues like poverty or other challenging social problems, for example, there's in some cases a naive mapping where they say, oh yeah, we can leverage these same ideas and go after that. Well, there are critical differences there. And we'll talk about some of those challenges tonight. But what I want to do before we get to that is actually I want to share with you another example of an organization that is not focused exclusively online that surely, their example surely fits in with what I'm describing. And it's the Spanish fashion company Zara. What is interesting about Zara is they do not follow kind of the typical pattern in fashion, which is the following, which is basically as you're thinking about essentially future seasons. And I have a friend who's in fashion who does this, where if it's the springtime and she's already thinking about the fall, she's making predictions about what people are going to want to wear in the fall. And she says, look, it's a guess. I have really no idea what people want, right? Zara owns up to that. And they say, look, yeah, we have no idea what's going to be popular. Absolutely no idea. So what we're going to do instead is do the following. We're going to look in various markets. We're going to see what people are wearing right now. We're going to take those as base level ideas. We're going to riff on those and make variations of those ideas, make small batches of garments, put them in those markets, and see how well they do. So they're conducting their own small-scale experiments to test these hypotheses. And what makes that possible is they have basically dramatically reduced the time to go from an initial design to garments in store. So from a brand new design to the time that they put garments in store, they can do that in 4 to 5 weeks. If they're just riffing on an existing design, it's 2 weeks. So again, they've dramatically tightened that learning loop. And they're exploiting that to their advantage to do something that no one else can do. Because again, they've got so much more delay in their system. So the old way that I'm basically arguing we need to move away from is this idea of planning as prediction. Right? So not only in fashion, but in so many organizations today, we go through things like strategic planning exercises, where we make guesses about what sorts of alternative futures we think will unfold, right? And then we orient our strategy around those predictions. Now the problem is that when you're wrong, you then have to adapt to that reality, that new reality that you didn't anticipate. And so often, these same organizations that are making these predictions, they're very slow to adapt, right? So the cost of the prediction error plus the delay gets them into really hot water. And what I'm, again, advocating for is to say, look, organizations need to shift from planning as prediction to planning as knowledge aggregation. So again, with this shift from the future to the present, the goal is to say, okay, let's try to bring together as much knowledge about the present state of the world as quickly as possible, try to understand, again, where those opportunities are, and then to go after them. So now what I want to do kind of in the rest of the talk is talk about that process of knowledge aggregation, in contrast to the online examples. So again, like Facebook, Microsoft, LinkedIn, and all those, where for them, knowledge aggregation is about doing these high throughput, low cost experiments. It's a completely different game when we're starting to talk about arenas that are completely offline, right? And we now have organizations with people where knowledge is distributed, people are being exposed to different things in local environments, and we need to think about how do we do that? How do we construct that essentially shared vision of what conditions are on the ground, and then coordinate our actions around that? The first example that I want to talk through is one that I experienced basically in around the kind of the mid-2000s time frame. So around 2004, 2005, the #1 killer of US soldiers in Iraq was the improvised explosive device. Basically, we had insurgent groups that were taking whatever they could get their hands on. So whether it would be just ordnance that was lying around, cell phones, any kind of electronics, and they would be cobbling together weapons and putting those by roadsides, burying them, what have you. And basically, the insurgency was being run like a startup, right? They are basically they were constantly innovating, constantly trying different designs, doing experiments, seeing how the US military reacted to that, and changing their tactics. They got inside our OODA loop, and they were dominating us. And we were spending billions of dollars trying to catch up and failing. So basically, we had this following problem where here we are trying to learn and trying to get back ahead of this problem. And if you think about the US military as being kind of spread across this entire country, there were different elements of the US military that were being exposed to different insurgent groups. Some of those were communicating, and they were sharing lessons learned. On our side, we had certain parts of the military that were, unbeknownst to them, were being exposed to the same threat. Some of them were innovating faster than others, right? And we had this problem of, if there is a success in a certain part of the military in a certain region, we've got knowledge there that we need to share, right? And the question is, how do we get that to other people who can use that and really take advantage of it? If you think about, how do we do that? How do we share knowledge in an enterprise, right? Well, still today in 2014, it's pretty old school, right? So sure, we have question and answering forums, and we've made some steps forward, but in many cases, it's totally old school. If you have a question and you don't know the answer yourself, often you will go to someone you trust and you will ask them that question and say, hey, do you know how I do X? Right? And if they don't know the answer, maybe they know someone who knows the answer, and so on and so forth. The problem with that, obviously, is that kind of limits you to the knowledge that's available in your local network, right? And as far as the trust will get you, right? How do you make big jumps in that network, right? Particularly in situations when you need that. Now, Omar actually set me up for this, right? Because he actually started talking about some of these routing issues. And the interesting thing is that my co-founder actually did some really kind of trailblazing work in the mid-2000s on a system called Ilink. And what they did was they actually basically added technology to existing online communities for the US Army, namely company command and platoon leaders. So company commanders are captains in the Army. Platoon leaders, again, are first lieutenants. And the guys that started company command made this observation. They said, when we get back from doing training or other exercises, oftentimes what they do is they'll grab a case of beer, they'll go sit on a porch, drink some beer, and they'll talk. And they share knowledge. And these guys said, you know what? There are company commanders all around the world that are doing this every single day. We need to actually make an online space to make that a kind of a broader reality where we can do greater knowledge sharing. Now, my co-founder, Dave, he was at the Stanford Research Institute, and they built this system called Ilink that basically was a machine learning system that watched question answering behavior. And what it did is, over time, it learned how to map, basically, questions to experts. When they installed this in these communities, the Army soldiers were amazed. They said, this has breathed new life into these communities, and it's teasing out pockets of expertise that we just basically didn't know existed. And what's sad is this kind of technology is still not out there, right? And there's so many ways in which we can expand beyond that. The final example that I want to walk through that, again, talks about the power and the need for these capabilities to leverage what we call tacit knowledge, which is knowledge that's in people's minds, and it's very difficult to actually codify that, right? Such that these kinds of systems are really useful, where we can go and find the right person to ask and get them to engage. And in the environments where this can actually be really powerful, right, is in disaster recovery and post-war reconstruction type events. Disaster recovery in particular, where you've got a real timeliness to this problem, right? And this, in particular, I wanted to talk through a situation around Haiti. And actually, I thought that was the next slide. So I'm going to step back for a moment and talk more broadly just about this challenge of these strategic collaboration problems, or so-called wicked problems. And just as a side note, this idea of a wicked problem is actually one that came out of Berkeley here in 1973. There was a notable design theorist here by the name of Horst Rattel that wrote a really powerful paper about the idea of wicked problems and being these, what he was focused on was social policy planning problems, but basically he makes a very cogent argument for why scientific approaches to those types of problems will ultimately fail, or will certainly be rendered with a lot of friction in a lot of different ways. So in these kinds of problems, as I mentioned, kind of post-war reconstruction, disaster recovery, typically you'll have a situation like this where you'll have a number of different parties that come to the event. They all have local objectives that we would all agree are good, that they're trying to optimize for. But the problem is that when each of them engages and tries to do their local thing, oftentimes they can create a worse situation on the global picture. Right? So trying to not make the situation worse is usually the bar at which things are set. I spoke with a Marine one-star general who talked about this, and he said usually we talk about the disaster after the disaster, which is when all these parties show up, they try to do their thing, and it just makes the situation worse. So back to Haiti, particularly the earthquake. So one particular open source software initiative and related response event that got a lot of attention was this project called Ushihidi. And Ushihidi actually started in Africa when there was kind of post-election violence there a number of years ago. And the innovation that happened there was they were actually, once the government actually shut down the media, some local developers said, you know what, we need a mechanism by which to aggregate events of violence that we're seeing happen in the country. And they hacked together a simple mapping solution, but they also coupled that with using text messaging to collect reports from all around the country. And this platform has been used in a number of different events. In Haiti, in particular, this got a lot of press. They basically set up a short code in the country, and the Haitians themselves, the victims that you're trying to support, became this massive source of information in terms of areas that needed attention. This part of the story is well understood and people have talked about, but there's another part of this story that hasn't really gotten any major attention, which in some sense is even more critical. So what was happening when they set up that shortcode and they started getting all these text messages coming in, there's one problem. All of them were in Haitian Creole. All the responders, for the most part, spoke English and didn't understand Haitian Creole. So we were getting all of this great information, but it wasn't in a form that could be acted upon. There's a gentleman here in the Bay Area by the name of Rob Monroe who actually led the effort I'm going to describe to you, which is called Project 4636. And basically what he did is he said, okay, we need to try to crowdsource this problem. And what he managed to do through his own network, through basically high trust ties that he had in the development community, is he reached out to the Haitian diaspora and basically put out a call for volunteers. And folks showed up by the thousands. And then they quickly reconfigured a crowdsourcing platform to start feeding out these text messages and getting them translated. Now, it wasn't just a simple exercise of translating the text messages. The tacit knowledge that was being taken advantage of here was the following, which is you might have a message that says, okay, that this hospital in this neighborhood is running out of supplies, right? There's no GPS coordinates in that message, nothing that allows them to immediately mark it on the map. So the folks that were actually doing the translation were also leveraging their local knowledge to actually translate those descriptions into coordinates and also a corresponding message that could be put on the map. In contrast to the public story about Ushihidi being so dominant, and they weren't doing really the bulk of the kind of the geolocation and the transmission of these messages. Project 4636 was doing this. And basically those messages were a critical feed to the US military that was engaging. And for example, the US Marine Corps came back and said, please don't stop. You guys are producing valuable information for us that is helping us save lives. From a technology perspective, it was actually, again, quite simple. Like they were using essentially something equivalent to IRC chat to basically have discussions. So when particularly challenging text messages would come in that maybe somebody didn't necessarily know the answer, they would jump on this forum, and start talking. And there were a lot of things that were going on here, not only just translation activities, but there was social support activities going on as well. It turned out that folks who were so dedicated to this and just doing this over and over again for hours and hours and hours, they got so emotionally involved and so emotionally attached that they were starting to, over time, show signs essentially of post-traumatic stress. Right? So this, again, was a really powerful but yet basic application of technology, but again, it gave them enough power to leverage the collective wisdom of that crowd, the collective knowledge in terms of the local terrain, where people were, and were able to do amazing things. Just as a final slide to step back now and think about, like, in these domains, where do we need to go with technology? I still feel like in many respects we're really at the infancy of what we've seen. And in these so-called wicked problems, we have this situation where as the problem complexity grows and it really gets to a point where no one person can really understand the expanse of the problem, right? Rattel himself was talking about this notion that we need to basically build technology that supports groups of people to try to reason about what's taking place in a given environment and to actually construct an approach to dealing with that. One of the things, again, that he was talking about decades ago that was fascinating is he talked about technology as a reinforcer of natural intelligence. So artificial intelligence at the time was starting to come onto the scene, and he was very critical of it. He said, why are we trying to make machines smarter, right? We need to build technology that helps us do our jobs and reason about that complexity better. And this is something that, in recent years is people are talking about, but it goes under the label of augmented intelligence. But it's so fascinating to see him discuss that. It's such, so many years ago. So I'm going to stop there. I could go on for quite a while. There's a lot of different stories and things that I think are interesting and compelling, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of, again, what I think we're faced with as organizations and the implications in terms of, once we fully embrace the complexities that we're dealing with and the uncertainty, that I think it takes us to a different place in terms of how we reframe how we operate. And there's so many organizations that have yet to really fully embrace this because it leads to some challenging decisions in terms of how you structure organizations to move through that learning loop more effectively. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
Where did you work for? Who did you work for when you were working here at the Pentagon?
So I actually started in the intelligence community. I worked for an agency called the Defense Intelligence Agency. Decided that being in government was not the best answer for me. Then I went to the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins, which is a defense lab. Was there for about 8.5 years, and then I went to Lawrence Livermore National Lab for another 1.5 years. So on the whole, I actually started in the intelligence community at the age of 18, basically got a full scholarship from them, and spent summers going and working in different parts of the community, and then continued to support that community after graduating from graduate school. So. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you expand more on the routing point?
I'm sorry?
Can you expand more on the routing point?
And what's in
Applications, what do you think is next?
So what's really interesting, and I know you'll appreciate this, right? Sorry? Oh, okay, so the question was, could I expand more on just on the routing? So one of the things I'm sure you'll appreciate, I think you even made reference to in your talk, right, is well, we're trying to even just design systems where we're building in these interactive feedback loops. One of the things that we don't spend enough time thinking about is essentially decisions that we make in designing the user experience to make that more palatable and to support that. And one of the interesting lessons learned that I thought was interesting was asking Dave, when I asked Dave, well, how did you route the questions? Did you go straight to the experts? And he said, actually, no, we didn't do that, because that turned out to be not very effective. Because if the machine comes and all of a sudden goes, hey, will you ask this question? Oftentimes it gets ignored. So what they did was the following, is they actually would route, if they had a target in mind of who they thought was the expert, they'd route the questions to a high trust person that was connected to the expert and ask them to route it in, right? So it was an interesting kind of human machine, it's like cooperation to get the job done. And once they did that, they saw the acceptance rate go quite high. The other thing that was very interesting, he said there were cultural subtleties about how they phrased things in the community. So they needed to really understand the nature of the way the soldiers would communicate in there, what was important to them, and building all of that cultural context into the design was super key. Any other questions? All right, thank you.